design students, today we're going to begin our soft sculpture project, which is actually just sort of a study of sewing or stitching and template making. And it may feel really old-fashioned actually in the age of 3D printing to pick up a needle and a thread, but let me just kind of remind you, say for example, that like the clothes you're wearing, if you take a really close look at all the intricate stitching that goes into producing garment craft and fashion, or for that matter, a pair of gloves, right? Take a look at sort of all the kind of careful template making to make a glove that fits over a complicated form like your hand actually move and break in just the right places. But then also not just the kind of delicate fashion craft, but even the sort of structural strength of a stitch. I'm a rock climber, right? And a lot of our PPE, a lot of our safety equipment is bar tacked or stitched right at these really important seams. And these harnesses are strong, like thousands of pounds strong. If you don't believe me, an industrial span set, right? This stuff is, designed to, work on industrial sites and basically like pull huge pieces of construction equipment around and pull your car out of the ditch, right? I mean, this thing is fibers that are woven and then stitched at the very end. I mean, this thing's good for like 5,500 pounds. So, what can we learn in the process of, just putting needle to thread, needle and thread, and learning how to stitch in fabric, some basic running stitches, and then how can we sort of apply that to three-dimensional design and carefully think through the kind of craft of designing templates. Let's take a look. First, let's make sure you have all the supplies that you'll need to kind of begin this process. The soft part of the soft sculpture is going to come from our fill, right? And you have some of this polyfill, which is really just kind of like a blown polyester material. It's really kind of a springy, fibery material. Keep that all kind of tied together as best you can. Somewhere inside of there, there's a blue rubber band or something holding it all together. We'll come back to that fill in a couple of days. You've got a piece of fabric, and the fabric that I provided for you has probably been all folded up. Now, I ironed mine flat for the sake of demonstrating to you. It's a little bit easier if you're not seeing all these wrinkles. If you want to iron it too, just bring your iron up to high temp and give it one pass with some steam, and because this is 100% cotton, it should just lay flat, even if it's been really hard creased. Somewhere in your art kits, you'll also find your needle and thread. Now, the thread that we've got for you, some of you guys got white thread, some of you guys got black, but it's preloaded on a bobbin. You'll find a little tail hanging off the end, and that'll just unravel. The bobbin actually is designed to fit into certain brands of sewing machines, but for us, it just kind of was an easy way to store it. Now, if you go to buy thread at the store or something like that, oftentimes you'll see thread spooled up on one of these a little bit larger spools. They even come in much larger, like embroidery spools, depending on what you're working on. Comes in as many colors as you could possibly think of, and also comes in different weights and thicknesses. The thread that we're working with is a fairly fine, very thin thread. This thread is a little bit thicker, designed for upholstery or doing some sort of real tough threading. The needles that I've got for you, I've got stored in this piece of foam core. Now, the foam core is just a handy way of keeping track of them, because you'll notice that if you drop a pin or drop a needle, it'll just kind of disappear in a studio. So I recommend keeping those things stored in this scrap of foam core unless you're using them. You've got one needle that has an eye in it, and you've got a handful of needles that we'll use for pinning up your templates a little bit later on. We'll talk a little bit more about needles here in a bit. You may find that you'll also need a nice sharp pair of scissors. We've been doing a lot of work with razor blades this semester and X-Acto blades, but this is not an ideal tool for cutting fabric. Scissors work much better, and actually a rotary cutter would probably be the best, and my guess is that you probably don't have any, but instead of a straight cutting edge with a razor blade, it's actually a disc that rolls over the fabric. If you happen to have one, that might be a really great tool for you to cut your templates later on. So let's take just a little bit closer look at a couple of our tools. The fabric that you guys have is cotton fabric, and it's woven. Now, a woven fabric is essentially built on a grid, right? If you can look really, really closely at your fabric, you would see vertical fibers, and interwoven through those fibers, you would see horizontal fibers. That kind of vertical, horizontal, you could even kind of think of it as XY grid, is a really important kind of structure to fabric. And fabric has all kinds of different personalities and different kind of ways that it behaves based on this grid pattern. It also changes the way the edges of your fabric will look. Some of the fabric edges that you'll see may actually be cut because I broke down, I bought 7 yards of fabric and broke it down for each one of you guys, and so there are going to be cleaner cut lines. Some of those may actually be rough or ripped or frayed edges, and then some of those edges may have actually been finished edges. An interesting quality to woven fabrics has to do with that frayed edge. The frayed edge is where you really get to see the sort of like structure of the fabric itself, but because of that XY or sort of vertical, horizontal, warp weft pattern, woven fabrics always tear in straight lines. The first time I saw this, it kind of blew me away, but a small scissors cut and a straight tear. Now, it will pretty much always follow either the vertical or the horizontal, which is sort of a handy way of breaking down fabric, especially if the edges aren't super important to you and it's maybe not a super important fabric or material. But you get a quick sense of what woven fabric is material, or what woven material is made out of almost immediately. When you tear that edge, you get to see all the long threads and the frays coming out, and you should start to see similarities between the thread I gave you and the threads the material is made out of. They're very similar, and each individual thread is maybe not so strong, but when you put a piece of woven fabric all together and you have all those threads working together, it's fantastically strong stuff, and this is just kind of a cheap cotton rag, right? Now, just because we're on the topic, we're going to be working with woven materials, but there are materials, soft sculpture materials you can work with that are non-woven materials. Since cotton is a natural material, we can kind of stick with the natural materials and just kind of think about leather, right? Leather has a totally different kind of structure and feel to it. Think about the leather that's maybe used to make work gloves or to sew together a baseball. The seams that you're able to use in leather are a little bit different than the seams you're able to work with on woven materials. Now take a closer look at the needle that you have in your kit. I've got a few different needles here, and honestly there are as many needles as there are different materials and different kind of applications. The needle that we'll be using to do all of our sewing on one end has a very, very, very small opening. That opening is called an eye, and that is where we'll actually thread the thread through, which is a bit of a task if you've never done that before. The other pins will just kind of have a flat head, and they're not going to be used for sewing, but for holding, almost like clamping in place. Some of these other needles I have, they come in different lengths. They come in different diameters. I have some leather needles here that actually aren't rounded, but have sort of a triangular spike on the outside. It makes it a little bit easier to kind of pierce through leather. Now, you would change the needle that you use depending on the process that you're using. To do sort of the basic hand stitching that we'll use, we'll just kind of use kind of a standard stitching needle, hand stitching needle. Be careful, I don't mean to be too obvious here, but one end of the needle is where the eye is, and the other end is where the point is, and the point will draw blood if you're not careful. Now our first project, or our first attempt, will essentially be to try to get a basic running stitch between two pieces of fabric. And this is where it will be worth talking just for a minute about what it actually is stitching. Now I want you to sort of imagine, right, that I've got two pieces of fabric here and I'd like to stitch them together along a seam. Those two pieces of fabric lay flat right next to each other, and the stitches will be visible on the top, right? A stitch that I can just look at along the top here is visible, and it looks pretty much just like a dotted line. Now, the stitch length refers to the space between the beginning and the end of one stitch, and then the stitch spacing is how much space in between those. Now, keep in mind that for every stitch that we see on the front side of our fabric, there's sort of its mirror image on the back. Essentially, if we were looking at this in cross-section, we would see a stitch on top and a stitch on bottom, and what we wouldn't see would be the bit of thread that actually cuts through the material. If I sketch this out your stitches can be sort of described into sort of what shape they are. Some stitches, lay in as straight lines. Some stitches look more like X's, think like a baseball stitch. Some stitches literally just look like a set of vertical lines. But if you look at them in cross-section, you can almost kind of imagine them like waveforms. And this is really handy to sort of understand the technology of how stitching works and how it actually behaves like a light clamping pressure between two strips of material. And if you use enough of them, it is an incredibly strong edge. What we're going to do to practice our seams just a little bit would be not to waste any of our fabric just yet, but to actually just use some paper. Now, yeah, using paper will be a good way to sort of learn not only the in and out of how to lay stitches in, but that also because we can use a pencil and a ruler to carefully space our stitching. So grab a piece of paper. I'm going to fold this one over. So just the way that we'll be stitching our fabric together in the future, essentially we're going to bring two pieces of fabric together and run a stitch line across them. We're going to do the same thing here with our pieces of paper. But before we actually put any needle to thread, let's actually mark out a seam line. If you happen to have a ruler around, this would be really handy. Otherwise, you could use the grid on your cutting mat. Essentially, I want to carefully lay out an evenly spaced stitch pattern here. And if I lay a straight edge along one end here, I can kind of lay in a straight line, top to bottom. Now all of my stitches fall along a straight line. That'll avoid this sort of wandering stitch path. And then I want all of my stitches to be about a 1 centimeter stitch. And so on my straight edge here, I have it marked off in inches and centimeters. I'm just going to give my stitch line here, I'll give it like every half centimeter or so. Now, I wouldn't want to do this to my fabric because then I would see all these lines on there. And, if I really wanted perfect stitches, I suppose I could find myself a sewing machine and just run it through. But learning how to carefully space stitches and learning how to identify that line is really handy. Now, eventually in the future, when we're working on a woven material, if you really wanted to keep your stitches in straight lines, remember that vertical and horizontal grid pattern that's built into all fabrics. You can actually follow a stitch pattern right along the kind of warp and weft patterns of the fabric material itself, and that'll keep all of your stitches nice and in a row. But let's actually prepare to lay a stitched edge down our first practice piece of paper. And to do that, we have to get threaded up. So find the edge of the thread off your bobbin. There's a good chance that it's probably trapped a little bit, so pull the first tail you see and pull off a little bit of that thread. Now, we'll probably end up needing quite a bit of what looks like quite a bit of thread, but you'll see here in a minute that we actually double it over. We're always sewing with 2 pieces of thread, and so we'll need a little more than you might imagine. I'm just going to pull off a stretch here and use my scissors to cut that. Now, in order to actually thread the needle, it can be a real pain to actually get those two to line up, and so try this little trick. If you wet the end of the thread, it stands all the fibers straight out, and you can more carefully get that to thread right through the needle. Now at the very end of this string, we'll want to kind of pull both of these strings so that they line up almost at the end, and we're going to tie an overhand knot, maybe even a double overhand knot. We need sort of a stopper knot at the end of our thread here. Now, you're not going to be able to easily see the knot that I'm tying here with my fingers, and if you don't know an overhand knot by name, I've got a solution for that. Now, when I'm talking overhand knot, think about the same knot that you might use to tie your shoes with, right? Looks a little bit like a pretzel. That would be a single overhand knot. Now, if we were just using one string of thread here, that would work, except that the back end of our needle has 2 strings coming out. So a double overhand knot is the same basic knot that you would tie your shoes with. It's just that it has 2 strings going through. Now, for some threads and for some materials, a single knot might be good enough, but I tied a double. Now, basically, a double is the exact same knot, but I pull a little bit more slack here, and I go through once, and I go through twice. Now for this larger bit of climbing rope, that double overhand knot really gets chunky. But for thread, that wadded up knot is just wide enough that it doesn't evenly fit through the tiny warp and weft, or the tiny vertical and horizontal pattern of the woven fabric. What we need is we need a knot to stop right when it pulls up against that thread. A piece of paper will be just fine. A paper is not woven, and so essentially your knot just needs to be as thick or thicker than your needle, because as your needle pierces the paper, it'll make a hole that's the size of the knot. Now that I've got my knot tied in the back there, I'm just going to trim off any excess. Now I'm ready to start my first stitch row. Now because I marked this off at about 1 centimeter and 1/2 centimeter, essentially I'm going to have a stitch spacing and a stitch length that's equivalent. 1/2 centimeter stitch length, 1/2 centimeter stitch spacing. As I pull the thread all the way through, the knot stops right where the first hole is pierced, and now I need to come back up through the paper and come right through that hole. Now, because I'm coming up from the blind back, I'm not going to be able to hit that hole just perfectly, so before I go back in, I'm just going to pierce the paper from the front, and that way I know right where the hole is so that I can make my stitch spacing even. When I reach the end of my stitch pattern, say maybe my stitching is complete, like this seam is more or less complete, or say I run out of string and I need to restart with another one, I bring my scissors back and I cut off the needle, and I like to leave a little tail of thread on the back of the needle. That way it's just easier to find if I happen to drop it. Make sure I put my needle back in the needle carrier. And now I'm going to tie, just as if I was tying my shoelaces, I'm going to tie these two threads together to create another stopper knot and prevent that from pulling out the other side. Now, if a single pass makes a knot that's big enough, that's great. I'm going to double knot it. That way I know that the knots won't pull out. And then I'll cut the tails off really short so that I don't see the extra bits. Congratulations, your first stitch pattern, right? Now this is a very particular kind of stitch. It's the most basic stitch. It might be called a straight or a running stitch. We carefully measured it out. It's a half centimeter stitch length and 1/2 centimeter stitch spacing. Tomorrow we'll come back and actually begin working on a template to put together our first 3-dimensional form.